Jenny, ligela izingxoxo exoxo ngamaxoxo equmukele emthonjeni. A warm welcome to you all. This is a continuation of a conversation that we began last week. And in Dialogue 1, not to really do a deep summary, we tried to really do a dive into the contextual moment through a set of interconnected lenses of bodies, resources, land and water, as well as closing political space. Tracking in the chat, which we did, it was quite an unusual and dynamic conversation on issues that I think we all feel are usually quite siloed, but which we brought together, in Dialogue 1 as a set of interconnected things, which is actually critical in terms of how we think about strategy and change in this time of what some call a syndemic or a polycrisis, right? A cluster of related global risks with compounding effects, such that, the overall impact really exceeds the sum of the parts. And so I think we're challenging ourselves, right, to hold that kind of analysis and approach in order to build a bridge from Dialogue 1 into today, where we're really going to be thinking about strategy, right? So power, movements, and the change piece of what it is that we need to be cognizant of. And so to kick us off, I'd really like to warmly welcome Crystal and Tasso. So yeah, there you go. Welcome. We'll wait for Tasso to turn his camera on. Excellent, fantastic. Welcome to you both. And as listeners to the last conversation, and with the benefit of some reflection on Dialogue 1 last week, perhaps we'll start with you, Crystal. What are some of the critical trends that we as social justice and movement actors are needing to be paying attention to, given given the conversation that we had last week? So over to you.
Thanks, Shireen. Last week was really great. And as I listened, I had a lot of questions, but also reflection on how intersecting different silos work. And then left, and I guess it was a seed in my brain as I was privy to different conversations in the last week, and have a few more questions in regard to the conversation. And I think part of what came up is how deeply integrated all the different work that we sometimes feel like is very separate has an interconnection. This interconnection of bodies, of land, of water, of our economies, of power, and the same structures of extraction is repeated over and over. The same ideas of subsidizing big mega power, whether that's through our resources, whether that's through women's labor, whether that's through different, all sorts of things, really came to the fore. And, in looking at, I spoke a little bit about dreaming and reimagining and unshackling ourselves from the current status quo, which then feeds a little bit in the conversation around social movements, movement building and power, and wondering about the way that we organize now in response to that. I said last time that all of these happen in intersection and in complexity, and our response to the problem has to be as complex and not as simple as, working in silos. And how do we do that? And wondering if the way that we currently organize through formal structures of organization so that we're able to attract funding and resources has an opposite effect to the struggle and resistance. Wondering how, social movements are then forced to be organizations with organizational development programs and policies and structures for money to flow down through them that really moves people and movements away from the core work of resisting. And now suddenly you're trying to think about finance policies and budgets and log frames, and that work keeps you so busy, and at the expense of doing the real liberatory work that is so needed. I also wonder about what the role of individuals and individuals within a collective are, and how do you support and resource what somebody referred to as nodes in the movement and sparks that connect people and movements and ideas, and where's the role for that and for them to exist? Many a time it's women who are connecting many different spaces and people and ideas, and how do we see and recognize them without this industrialization of the industry of change and resistance, sometimes what I call it. And balancing that with, coming to terms with the truth that the work needs to be resourced and that it is work. But how do we create structures that fight against that formulation of it, that make it into an industry that doesn't deliver, and we're constantly just busy doing things that are not really helpful. And someone gave me this quantum physics concept of entanglement, an entanglement. And basically what it says is, when you give something attention, you legitimize it and you give it energy and space and attention, and that becomes a thing. And I've been thinking about the role of places like the UN or the African Union here. And what does that come as a cost to what? And should we be focusing on highlighting some of the work that lives in the periphery of this work and is seen as fluffy? And I see my colleagues who engage in UN processes, I guess there's a need for it, but then how do you stop when you get sucked in and you begin to mirror that same oppressive violence that they put out in the name of change? So I have a lot of questions, and I have a lot of like my brain has gone into very different strains of thought of how do we, it's resistance to pull all of these things together in and of itself, to say, what life is, how does our economy work for us? Where is our place in a global economy? How do we take up space that we own, our right to be here, to live in happiness and joy and dignity, and not letting go of those things that can sometimes be seen as fluffy and abstract, but really coming back to the heart of what we're fighting for, that relates to people's sexual and reproductive rights, that relates to people's relationship with the land, that relates to what work and labor means, and how does that contribute to what life looks like for so many people, and really have a conversation that centers class, race, sex, and gender at the heart, without making everything just so technical that it's removed of any politics, I think. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Crystal, for kicking us off. So a lot of ideas on the table. And I want to just push it a little further, if that's okay. I mean, I think, as you rightly saying, the context is really forcing us to ask questions about our organizing vehicles and whether those are actually the vehicles with all of the trappings that they come with, funding, NGOization, et cetera, to really ask ourselves the question whether those vehicles are actually the vehicles that are going to lead us to liberation. I think another important piece that I want to pick up in what you're saying is that liberation is premised on the ability to dream and imagine, right? What are we actually building power for? Right? And then how do we come together? And I think one of the things that you've put on the table is, if I have to use different language, an idea of meshworks, right? What does it mean to be a set of interconnected nodes or hubs in driving a liberatory agenda? And I want to turn to you, Tasso, because I think one of the things that we are exploring here is, and I think we did a deep dive in some way last week on, if I have to use a different framing, the features and aspects of the authoritarian playbook. Power is consolidating in very, very particular ways, as we noted last week. And I wonder, Tasso, if you could speak a little bit given, the elements that Crystal has put on the table for things we need to think about, what is the authoritarian playbook? Because some of these aspects that I think you've lifted up, Crystal, are important to think through as we think about power building, given where it is our context is and how power is configuring. So over to you, Chasa.
Thank you, Shireen. Hello, Crystal. I'm honored to share space with you and other powerful analysts and strategists. A quick note about my point of view. I work at a center of research and strategy where we analyze supremacist and authoritarian movements in order to support and advise social justice movements. My organization, Political Research Associates, works mostly in the US, but we study the right globally. I'm myself a child of the Brazilian military dictatorship and grew up in exile in the United States, and that history informs my perspective on these things. Crystal, in the first dialogue, you offered this beautiful idea that we're in a time of world making, thinking and dreaming, liberation dreams. We're of course also living through a period of world remaking by right-wing authoritarians. The authoritarian playbook is long, so I will try to highlight some particular features that I think are in conversation with the issues that Crystal has put on the table. So some of those features include certainly closing space for dissent and for the exercise of freedom. And whether that space is in governance, the media, among the people, in houses of worship, within families, right? So we see repression of journalists, activists, justice-oriented social movements, political opposition, minority religions, internally colonized populations. The naming of internal and external enemies is essential, and claims that the autocrat's base of support has been victimized, right? Even and especially if they're already in the dominant social and economic position within society. So we see white Americans are being replaced by Black and brown people, Hindus by Muslims, God-fearing by the impure, corrupt and profane, the worthy by the undeserving. And gender plays a huge role in all of this. Misogyny and patriarchy are, of course, pillars of authoritarianism and of fascism. The wrong kinds of bodies, right, are reproducing. Feminist and degenerate sexuality are undermining society from within. The patriarchal family order is the model for the state, with a strongman leader at the top. And so the authoritarian playbook involves methods for valorizing and enforcing hierarchies of power, especially those that are rooted in male supremacy, in racial and ethnic nationalism, in religious supremacy, and in capitalism, in economic Darwinism. And those hierarchies are promoted as natural, moral, inevitable, right? Militarism and militarized masculinity are elevated and come to the fore. But distinct from totalitarian or like openly fascist movements, the authoritarian playbook also maintains at least the pretense of democracy, right? Power is increasingly concentrated in the executive branch, with legislative and judicial branches is subsidiaries, right? Elections happen, even if they're not consequential, and state-aligned media report popular support for the regime. So the appearance of legitimacy of popular support is really important under authoritarianism. There's not the full consolidation of power that you have in totalitarian regimes. And so that the appearance of consent. As Sonia cautioned last week, we should be careful about overgeneralizing, right? Conditions vary. Authoritarianism has different features in India, Brazil, Uganda, Poland, United States, and so forth. But there are discernible tendencies in trends across countries. And of course, autocrats get ideas from each other. So there are trends, there are fashions actually in authoritarianism, just as there seem to be in other things. To just mention a couple of things. One, we typically see the mass mobilization of patriarchal religious movements into politics, right? Often through the generation of moral panics over threats to the order from feminists, from homosexuals, these days from so-called gender ideology, right, which Sonia spoke to last time, children, the family, and so therefore civilization is under attack and must be restored. Militant and militarized forms of masculinity are valorized, right? There's one way to be a man, and it's to exercise this kind of militant and even lethal kind of devotion to the state. We likewise see the mobilization of racial and ethnic nationalists who claim to be the only true people. They may demand social welfare for themselves, for their group. So whether it's Hindutva, Hindu fascism, white nationalism in the US, European ethno-nationalism, or other variants. And Sonia pointed to this very important thing. Autocratic politicians tend to draw these different factions into their coalition where they compete as well as cooperate with each other. They have sort of different end games, right? Different visions of the good society, but they have to cooperate. They all require the coercive powers of the central regime to impose their version of the proper order. So there is this heterogeneous quality or just contradictions within the coalition that can be a weakness for the regime. There are opportunities for us to exploit. I guess the last thing I want to say is when liberal or bourgeois democratic democracies fall apart, they also often descend into or succeeded by authoritarianism. So to some extent, authoritarianism is what democracy looks like when it fails. And that transition can be swift. And I put democracy in quotes because we've had very few examples of something we consider to be authentic democracy. That transition can be swift, as within the military coups of the second half of the 20th century, or it can be slower. And in the current period, we're experiencing a kind of global march of authoritarianism, which has fewer of these quick kind of putsches and more the steady erosion of the cultural and political obstacles to the concentration of authoritarian power, slowly taking over the courts, whether in Poland or the United States, building up the military, creating these moral panics, creating the conditions in which a vigilante base of support will independently go after the targets named by aspiring autocrats. So these are the dynamics that increasingly characterize the places in which we are also contesting for power.
Great, thank you, Tasso, and thank you, Crystal, for kicking us off. There's a thick set of ideas that we've put onto the table right at the start of this dialogue, and I think we're going to work with them in different ways through different rounds of conversation as we wade in to this dialogue more fully. You both, in some way, remind me of the Gramsci quote, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters. And I think the ability to dream, the ability to create space for, as you say, Crystal, world making is in some way a counterpoint, as is how we think about resourcing writ large movements that are building or that are invested in long-term power building. Not easy and straightforward work. But I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator now, Alexa, to move us forward in this conversation. But before I do, maybe to just note, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, who you are, where you're from, and also to note that we are putting the bios of all of the speakers into the chat so that you will have access to that information too. Over to you, Alexa. Thanks, Tasso.
Thanks, Shireen, and thanks, Tarso and Crystal, for getting us off right away into the deep end of this conversation. Really rich grounds on which to build. And I think one thing that's clear from what you're both saying is the essentialness of movements to be able to, and organizing social justice movements to be able to confront and face the kinds of challenges that we're articulating, and to be able to do the dreaming and to give birth to that new world. But I want to invite my colleagues, Patricia and Pumi, to join me here in conversation. Welcome, Pumi. Welcome, Patty. Patricia Aran, Pumi Natetwa, two colleagues from Jazz. Let's talk about movements. We use that term in these kinds of conversations quite a bit. But we can't romanticize movements, right? We're talking about the deep and challenging work of movement building. And we know that there are fractures, there are challenges, there are weaknesses and gaps in movements. And I think we need to be honest about that and look at some of the realities of that and some of the risks and consequences of those kinds of challenges. So I want to, maybe we'll start with you, Patty. When you look out, what do you see as the actual state of organizing? Where are movements strong? Where do you see maybe some promising developments of organizing? And where do you see things that should concern us all, that we need to pay more attention to? So let's start with you, Patty.
Thank you, Alexa, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. We're seeing that movements are facing, firstly, a very complex world with very complex power dynamics. These power dynamics are difficult to understand and difficult to process in all their different dimensions. Movements are also facing constant repression from fundamentalist and conservative forces. And these are forces that are using the judicial power, the laws, and of the democratic state to persecute, to go after movements, leaders, defenders who defend rights. And what I have seen is that captures a lot of the energy movements which should be directed towards strengthening the movements. Instead, they have to be constantly reacting and defending themselves from these threats and attacks. There's also a narrative, a discourse that we constantly see in the media, and that permeates large sectors, large social groups. And therefore, movements have to be constantly counteracting those narratives. Specifically, I'm referring to women here. We're also facing the consequences of climate change in our daily lives, which represents a greater impoverishment, a greater impact on the population. And logically, that means that people have to worry about how to survive each day. This can strengthen individualism, in quotation marks, because it's that fight for survival, which makes that organizing work even more complex. And in many countries, there are people who don't have access to information or don't speak hegemonic languages, and therefore interpreting and analyzing what is happening in the world becomes much more complicated for movements. On the other hand, I'm also seeing an opportunity to identify the problems that we are facing through a more systemic lens, to see that the problems that movements are facing in different places are similar, that there are similarities and parallels in those problems. And I think that has contributed to a much more complex understanding. And so movements can identify themselves, can see parallels in each other and work together. So this is a very complex moment, but there are a lot of opportunities as well, where I think that the movements are starting to relate to each other in different ways at a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you so much. I think that what you're laying out really helps us see how the dynamics on the landscape can, in very real ways, put a brake on what movements are able to achieve. And yet, I think you're also pointing to some hopeful dimensions of that, that sense of the interconnectedness of the challenges we face. So I think that complexity is what I'm hearing you say, Patty, is demanding a complexity from our side as well, and how we think about power and organizing. I want to bring you in, Phumi, both to share from where you sit in terms of how are those kinds of complex dynamics affecting movements, and where do you see both promising, developments, and what do we need to pay more attention to if we're serious about building movement power?
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everybody, and thanks, Patty, for that intervention. I think the complexities also has to extend to movements or existing, especially organizers, understanding that the enemy, so to speak, is not necessarily the state. It's the elite, it's capital as it organizes itself. That if I think about the previous segment and also about the collapse of democracies, where there are few democracies in space, it invites us to think about what are the different actors that actually are holding the interests that are affecting the ways in which we can think about movements. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that is important is that the constant attacks on movement, on organizing, and here I'm talking about progressive movements, right? The let's say left-leaning, the constant attacks on movements, or even the infiltration in many parts of the world, actually indicates to us that the project of the anti-rights, if you like, is of course to weaken the possibility of building power for. And therefore we are constantly having to reorganize, refine ourselves, because their attack and the amount of resources that the other side has, it's way much more than us in Crystal's ways having to scramble for the funding that is available. That I think movements are engaged in major internal diagnosis. I think we have to keep lifting that movements are made of people. They're not just machines. They're made of people who face the grim, the brunt of what the majority, especially working class and poor people face, right, across the world, and then in particular places where the bodies are black and brown. And that brunt of carrying in relation to what it means to be that person today living and having to organize, of course, has implications in relation to how you will show up and how you will be able to do movement work. And I think oftentimes we can like put that at the back and not put it at the center of what is needed in terms of movement, having movements to think about what does the movement need internally in order to be strong. I think movements movements that have been successful, that continue to exist today and that we learn from, that have folded, have often been good in terms of like naming the enemy and challenging the enemy and winning. Then the enemy comes back to reorganize itself again. But the hardest work, I think, of movements have been to look internally in relation to the fractures, the tensions, the stresses, the load, the multiple ways in which we both have to care for the movement itself because we want the movement to succeed, but also we have to care for the people that make up the movement. So I would say part of thinking about the movements is to hold that complexities in thinking about how multiple the enemies are, how multiple, it's not just the state, it's the elite interest, it's capital in its various forms, but also to think about how are the souls and how is needed to actually carry that. Then the other part is often we think about networks and connections and building bridges that are important to kind of like think about movements for what, right? Because we've been clear about the things that maybe we are against, the things that we don't want. But I think equally there is a maturity and a nuance that we need to reach in relation to what it means to build power for the world that we want, that can include progressive, NGOs, progressive initiatives and networks that can have like, for us, some of that historical ways, fundamentals, disciplined and horizontal type of approaches in relation to what it means to carry a movement strategy forward.
I think, Pumi, what you're saying is so important. And I'm noting what you just particularly were talking about, sort of the need to have clarity about what we're building power for, not just what against. And I think I'm tying it into some comments in the chat people may be seeing that Sonia is raising the question of also when we say movements historically, perhaps many of us in the sort of progressive circles have thought of our movements, right, or our activism or our organizing. And of course, there has always been right-wing organizing, fundamentalist organizing, but we're seeing that, newly energized in many places. And so needing to think critically about some of the same people that we are trying to mobilize are also being targeted in many cases to be attracted, or some of the potential allies for movement work we're doing are being targeted to be by those same right-wing movements. And so I think there's just a nuance here on this landscape. I want to offer you just each a quick comment, just, how do we need to hold that conversation about power for? It's easy to say, we're kind of aligned in some way, but we know we're talking about aligning people across many different interests. How do we need to hold the question of power for in these moments where there is such an articulated kind of right-wing and fundamentalist discourse? If either of you want to add some comments, and then we're going to take this conversation into strategy, actually. Patty, do you want to make any additional comments?
I think that this generalization that Pumi was mentioning, we think about progressive movements. I think this generalization is very important because it's important to name, to recognize the fundamentalist movements on the right, which are gaining power and strength in this time. And therefore, I think that naming and understanding how they work is just as important. That's what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Patiana. I think part of thinking about the power for is to think, what is it that we have lost that we need to recover? And I like Sonia's comment because it doesn't mean even the movements that formed people like me are necessarily movements that I would say I embrace, because clearly, the place of women, the place of queers, the place of trans folks, there was no place or limited space. But I think that there are some important lessons from those formations that we can take as we think about what we want to recover. And I think a process of envisioning is going to be necessary, of course. Envisioning a world without capitalism, without racism, without patriarchy, without white supremacy. But more so to go a step further, because up until now, I think many of us, whether we think of the commons, we think of the peoples in their multiple identities, we haven't been able to actually think about how to defeat these forces of these systems of oppression, and then what do we want to build. There was a lot around COVID that we don't want to return to the normal. The normal was not good, but we've lost even that. We've lost even unpacking, that normal to even think about what is it that we are building. But I think in the moment that right now we are so much under attack, it seems like we are on the defensive a lot. And the defensive is going to be an important part of movement work and movement strategy, but it must sit next to, if we were not on the defenses, what does being liberated look like, feel like, and how do we live fully like those type of freedoms? And we need to engage in those type of conversations.
Thank you both so much. And I think this is an important pivot to now go back to you, Shireen, so we can dive more into what are the strategic implications of what you're saying, both the defensive and the imaginative and the proactive. So over to you, Shireen, for the next part of this conversation. Thanks, Pumi and Patty.
Thanks, Alexa. So moving us forward, I'd like to invite Tamara, Zeph, Sonia, and Tasso into the conversation more fully. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Fantastic. Given the reflections of the state of organizing movement formations and movements, noting the instability of the category that we are talking about and using, that Pumi and Patricia have begun to lay out, perhaps the question that we can, kick off an open round of conversation and reflection, Tamara, Zeph, Sonia, and Tasso, what does a movement playbook for social, gender, and racial justice need to look like? And let's start with you, Tamara, and we'll just interweave a conversation as we go.
Sure. I think that's a big question, which we're holding big questions today. I think movements for social justice rely on, there's an unspoken relationship between oppression and liberative movements, because all the resources are held by design in the hands of one party and dispersed very slowly amongst everyone else. And so I think for, the US economy, like the basis of the economy is currently shaking precisely because movements are making very specific economic demands for resources. And so the political reframing of risk is a response to demands for equity. And so as movements become very clear about the relationship to resources, about their relationship to labor, and the utility of all the silos to diffuse our capacity, the government apparatus, industry, equity moves together, organizing in their own way because they have been on the offensive. Or, well, that's a question. I had a chat with folks recently who were talking about whether or not movements for liberation are up against aggressively defensive groups or offensive groups. But frankly, as we become more offensive, we recognize that the system is built to fight us. And to fight us at a bunch of levels at the same time. And so if we don't have our eyes in a place of simultaneity, if we're not looking at our own needs through a complex lens, if we are not figuring out how the isms serve to depress our capacity, then we are already in a crouch that doesn't have a trajectory towards success. And climate change will only double down on it, which our opposition has already considered. So this is really a moment where we will require everyone doing everything with a set of skills we have not practiced together. So, but as an environmentalist, the teams are only Team Earth and Team What Else Is There, right? So, and the What Else Is There team is pretty excited about their reality, so we should become pretty excited about ours.
Thanks, Tamara. I'm really going to cast it open. Would anybody like to jump in and pick up on some of the provocative threads that Tamara is weaving into our conversation? Zeph, I see you unmuted.
Thanks, Tamara. And just to add on, and this has also been brought up by Patty and Pumi, the silos, the fragments, the infiltration that, movements had experienced. It's not just by accident, it's all by design. And that not to forget that over the many years of colonial oppression, they have already kind of, in a way, re-strategized, perfected, and tested some of the strategies that they are applying to curtail or crack movement formations across many different parts of the world. And they use many different tactics. Sometimes they use movement tactics and formation to counter movement consolidation that we have. And so it's really a painstaking work that movements are doing, plus the infrastructures of state being funding the silos and the single issue strategies that a lot of groups in the development sector are falling. And this had impacted movement formations. And I think what I'm saying is that we also need to look at where are they consolidating power? What areas are they consolidating power? And not to disengage, but to engage on those, to make it visible and expose, to use their space to turn their own tables against them. And so I know it's easy said and than done, but I think in order for us to also be proactive and the side of being offensive in a way that is safe, is to understand the complexity that despite the shared strong men model that's being normalized in the world, that there are also nuances in specific contexts. And so the offensives needs to be anchored in contexts, and knowing that the engagement doesn't mean legitimizing current the status quo, but to engage on the perspective that it could further consolidate and strengthen movement organizing work. And so I think that's a layer that I also want to include, because while there are different parts of movement formations in the world, and even formations that's building autonomous kind of governments and governance that's centering people power, there are still the higher the backlash and the higher the investment to stop organizing, or to dismiss and to crack or to infiltrate these movement formations. And so there is an uprising going on. It's not that we're talking about strategy, that we are starting from scratch. And I think there's already lessons there. And for us, that comes from movement formations as well. It's not like it's also perfect and joyful, but there's always something to learn and to build on. And I think we just need to not lose sight on who we are building power for. And I think that's what we also mentioned in the earlier segment.
Oh, thanks, Zeph. Also, Sonia.
It's a pleasure to be with you all again. I think I'm going to be very brief. I was thinking of a famous phrase by John Scott a long time back, when we were starting the intellectual debates on gender back in the 80s. And Scott wrote something that kept returning in my life experience, which is to say, there are no easy responses for difficult problems. And I do think that we should perhaps locate ourselves in this conversation within that frame, to recognize the scale of the complexity and not try to move very swiftly towards a quick response, because those quick responses are not that at hand. And I think that instead of that, we should recognize the challenge of this complexity and to set the conditions for processing it. And I'm saying so because, picking up on something that has been said before about the industry, and I'm using that trope as a sort of umbrella, I think that our haste to find a solution, to a large extent, derives from the pressures of that industry upon us. And I think we should take distance from that and try to provide us the necessary space for reflecting collectively about this, not just this enormous complexity of the world where we are, but also about find ways for naming precisely and wrestling with the causes of the silos that plague our ways of doing politics, which have many manifestations and they differ from place to place. But I guess that most principally, and perhaps once again, I'm saying so from my positionality of having gone through the 4 years of the experience of living on the edge of a full post-fascist abyss, which is not gone, I should say. I mean, it's not disappeared. It's just has been, in the worst case scenario, we can say it's maybe just delayed. And I think that the other thing that I feel is that I do not think that progressive movements, by and large, and feminist, queer, anti-racist movements in particular, have yet been able to more collectively recognize the scale of the crisis and the risks we are living, and to name it as it is, to create a sort of common language, and share instruments on how to resist this threat, which in my view is here to stay for some time. I don't think it's going to go away easily. I'm being sort of radical realistic here. And I think we should be clear about that. And how to do that without losing our imagination, as Fumi said. How to play, to balance our ability to be very realistic about the conditions of the world, about the contingencies under which we are operating, and at the same time not lose our creativity in imagining other worlds.
Thank you, Sonia, for adding another layer to this conversation that I think is important as we build it and push ourselves to wrestle with context and think about the complexity and what that means for the work that we are committed to in terms of liberatory futures. Tasso.
Well, I certainly agree with what I hear my colleagues saying about no simple answers, right, to a very complicated situation. I tend to agree with what Sonia is saying in multiple ways, including that I think we are in for an extended period of struggle here with rising authoritarianism, maybe a generation-long struggle, if we are honest about the momentum that it has in the ways in which the climate crisis that Tamara spoke to will also compound that, creates many opportunities for disaster authoritarianism. It creates conditions for what we're already seeing is a shift from climate denialism towards more kind of a climate realism and climate nationalism, where climate crisis becomes, in fact, a rationale for authoritarianism and for supremacist movements. So we're in a very dynamic period. I think one of the ways to think about challenges before us is to think around alignment rather than one kind of solution, right? There's a tendency to think, what's the answer? This is a really dangerous, I think, Western mode of thinking about problems. There are many different kinds of struggles before us. And I think thinking about where we align around some key challenges rather than trying to get everyone to do the same thing is an important notion. As others have mentioned, we're in a period where part of the danger is to only be on the defense, to only defend. And so we have to think about ways that we can interrupt the advance of the concentration of authoritarian power, how we build under those conditions, because it's very difficult to build under authoritarianism, and how we do that in ways that are not only about defending the status quo, which is a terrible status quo in most places, but also create the conditions for transformation. So this notion of block, build, transform, and making sure that we are dedicating our human capacity towards all of those kinds of activities. I do think that in this period of rising authoritarianism, in some ways there are more people available to us potentially, even while there's some closing of political space and polarization. And partly this is because relatively privileged classes of people feel threatened now by authoritarianism. You know, they had it good and suddenly they realized that their own civil liberties and freedoms and so forth can be taken away. And so these changes shake things up and create opportunities for contestation for new groups of people to join in either a freedom struggle, right, or to throw their lot in with autocrats. And we have to pay attention to that. It's very important that we don't allow, for instance, middle and elite classes to fully throw their lot in with autocrats. When that happens, it's very difficult to stop. And so it's often not the tendency of popular movements to think, oh, how do we position in a way that we could peel elites away from this? But it's a necessary set of challenges for us in this period. I guess one last thought I want to share is, this will sound like preaching to the choir, right, in this grouping, but in most places where whatever degree of democracy that may exist is under threat and is declining, in very few cases is it understood that questions of gender, equity, and power, and questions of race are often central, right? There's a discourse around democracy, there tends to be, and then there's a discourse around incremental inclusion, right? Whereas in this moment, the way that authoritarians are building power is often by leveraging exactly on these fulcra, right? They are mobilizing gender resentments, they're mobilizing racial and ethnic resentments. Whether we have some version of democracy or authoritarianism is essentially located around these questions. And so one of the things that I think is important in this period is to push our concerns around gender and race into the center of debates around democracy and whether we will have it, and to polarize in a way that also makes it clear that resourcing the possibility of democracy requires resourcing, right? Movements for gender, racial justice, and climate sanity. And so I think, again, by making that claim that these are not separate questions, in fact, these are the questions on which we will have a democratic future or not, is a way of putting our movements in contestation, in ways that are central to national discourses, and therefore have the possibility of more resource mobilization, both in terms of money, but in terms of people, right? In terms of competing for the allegiance of people. And we've seen some openings for that around this. We saw that around the racial uprisings, racial justice uprisings in 2020, where suddenly there was much broader public consciousness around these questions. And that's just one of many examples I'm sure we could all tell. So I do have hope, right? So to your time of monsters, Shireen, with which I agree, I add, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the spirit. I do think that there are opportunities for us in this period, and we have to be really bold about leaning into them, and not let our general assessment of the way the trends depress us into thinking that we don't have opportunities for growth and maneuver in new fronts of contestation.
Exactly. Thank you, Tasso. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Zeph. Thank you, Tamara. I want to lift up something from the chat that I think, Shirley, you dropped in there, because I think it's a bridge, based on what it is that you've just said, Tasso. And I think what it is that we are all trying to point to, given the challenges of the complexity, how are we still able to hold on to and create the conditions, right, for liberatory work, for liberatory agendas, for liberatory ways of being. And Shirley's note in the chat, our future vision means a rethinking of Western ways of knowing and being. And this requires us to unlearn and relearn, and learn fundamentally different ways of being, learning a relational life-giving approach. And that's the revolution of mind, body, and heart. And I agree, feminists have a lot to offer, and feminist popular education has a lot to contribute, both as an approach and a method, to what you inviting, I think, us to do, Sonia, hold the complexity and create the conditions to process it, as opposed to being reactive in a way that may work against us, given the complexities. I'm going to transition us there to a little interlude. We're not going to be taking a complete break or a short break today. Instead, one of our conversants, we know Ketch, was unable to be with us today, but recorded some reflections which we would like to play for you, to weave her thoughts into this conversation too. Before we go to the video, just another reminder to please choose a language channel, because that will be the only way that you'll be able to hear the clip, given that we're also trying to record sound and video today. So over to our tech team to screen the video.
Hi, I was asked to reflect on the implications for movement organizing and strategy in light of the conversations that were held during the last dialogue. I would like to emphasize 3 main points. The first is on the principle of contagion. What we noticed globally around closing civic space, as well as other issues, is that an action in one country or one region almost always immediately leads to a similar action or a more extreme version of the initial action in a different country. Our task as movement support organizations, is to ensure that we are actually anticipating rather than reacting to these kinds of events. But in order to do that, the second point is also critical. We cannot anticipate if we do not have the resources that allow us to do so in the ways in which we consider most useful to the moment, the context, and the needs of the movements that we are serving. Herein lies the question of resourcing movements that actually thrive, resourcing movements that respond to strategy rather than an action or projects. And this is a long conversation that feminist philanthropy organizations and the philanthropy space has been engaging in for quite a long time. The third and final point is around the transnational. We know today that our issues are transnational in nature. The actors that mobilize around a range of issues that are counter to the ideas of freedom and justice that we're interested in are transnational in nature, organizing resources, organizing across religion, organizing across values and principles, which unfortunately means that they're therefore much more stronger in consolidating their ideas than we are. Consequently, movements across the globe who are interested in fighting these forces of necessity have to work through some of the challenges that have made transnational organizing more complex, more challenging, more difficult. Resourcing becomes a very important part of that conversation, but it's also a conversation around working across ideology, working across the silos that have of necessity made organizations and movements work in separate ways rather than in connected ways that challenge the structural and systemic issues that we are all interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Owino. Wonderful to have her words here with us and that set of reflections she's brought. I'm noticing that in the chat there was some confusion. I just want to address that briefly, which is because we're moderating this conversation in multiple languages and there's simultaneous translation, you must choose a language channel to hear all the audio. So if you are new to doing that, you go to the bottom of your screen where you'll see a little globe, click on that, and it will allow you to choose the language you want to listen in. Thanks for bearing with that, everyone. So I think just to say a few things, and then we're going to bring in Crystal, Pumi, Patricia, and Tamara to have a next round of conversations. I think some of the things that were put on the table in the prior conversation and Owino is underscoring is the question of transnational solidarity and the need for looking for new allies, finding new ways of connecting that perhaps will take bolder or different kinds of action on our part. And, so what will feed the seeds, what will nurture that kind of, I think Tarso used the word alignment, what will enable us to have that kind of alignment to transcend those silos? And what do we need to sort of think about as our shared aspirations that can take us beyond a struggle of resistance or a defensive struggle? And I want to invite Crystal, Pumi, Patricia, and Tamara to join me here in conversation. Many challenges on the table, right? We could talk all day and still have more to say. So we want to focus ourselves a bit here. One of the things we can see on the political landscape as we look at this consolidation of power on the right is that on our side of that spectrum of political change, or our sides of that, one of the things that we have lost perhaps in more recent decades is an aspiration to have governing power, which was an animating aspiration for many liberation movements, right? That we can think about. But we know why we've lost that. I mean, all of the corruption, the disappointment, the state capture, there's lots of reasons for that. But I think it's important to ask ourselves, how do we go? And, Tarso, you put this on the table. How do we go beyond being on the defensive and have that sense of what is the aspiration that we're building for? Are we, in the movement playbook, this sort of social justice movement playbook, what does it mean to take our collective power seriously? What do we think about decision-making spaces, the state, governance? That's a provocative question. We have lots, there's no one answer. It's a complex question, but what is our relationship to that? I want to maybe start with you, Phumi, and then open it up to any of the others of you that want to speak to that.
I'm an eternal optimist. We need to think about the we and our collective power. I think that's important as a first starting point. I want to pick up on Tasso and Sonia by starting off by saying our strategies need to be multi-pronged. We cannot afford to do the one without doing the other. And I think right now, completely going into the defensive is of course problematic, just as much as we are thinking of the rhythms of everyone who has to be part of the strategy. Requires that those that are far much ahead need to slow down a bit so that we can actually, find rhythms in which we can work together. I think in that multi-prongness of the strategy, there is a part of, that combines both the part of bringing everyone transnationally, nationally, locally, along what are we talking about? What are these systems that are constantly attacking us to then be able to design actually the tactics that are going to defeat those type of projects. I do think importantly as well is, I think it comes up in Awino and it has been lifted in the comments that what happens today in Uganda happens in the Bronze, happens in the Philippines, and we have to be able to, in my language, stop being domesticated in some ways, stop thinking about only what is in the immediate, but think about making the interconnections. A large part also has to do with, I think, relationships. We will not be able to build collective power if we do not untangle some of the tensions that exist amongst who we want to build collective power with. So I do think both the political, tactical, programmatic agenda needs to become accompanied by the people, to convene people who are already struggling against, unemployment, being no electricity, no water, having to defend land. All those various forces need to be part of the movement agenda. They need to sit squarely next to the political a project that we want to engage in. I do also think that there is a lot of movement, education, knowledge, not just more knowledge, but knowledge sharing, study circles type of thing that I think is being lost in part of the building of that collective power. We need to return to some of those very simple ways of understanding the complexity of the problems. And the only way to do that is by thinking about what's been produced by movement activists, organizers, that can actually nourish us more and more in relation to actually shaping our own views and strategies in relation to what we need to do. Consensus will never be easy. Movements require that we are on the same agenda to pursue the same political goal. It is a long and painful, hard process, but I think commitment and recommitment, whilst we know what we are for and what we are against, can actually help to create those type of spaces that enable those type of tensions to be held inside the movement space.
Thank you, Phumi. I want to open it up. What does it mean in this movement playbook to take our collective power seriously? What does that take? Any one of you wants to jump in? Go ahead, Crystal.
Yeah, both Pumi and Sonia have me thinking so much. The idea of study circles, that now we fundraise for a book club and people thought we were crazy. But it's really to go back to the wisdom and the knowledge of the work that has been done before us. And so many times we think that we're in a completely new struggle. But as the song says, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And sometimes it's political, it's important to go back to our own thinkers and our own African, from my perspective, our own Pan-African feminist thinkers that have done so much and produced so much knowledge that have continuously gotten invisibilized. And if you look at this sort of new age knowledge space, it's like, who do you quote? And it's, if you haven't quoted the latest economist, then your work is not legitimate enough. And it's resistance to go back to that. One way we do it at NAWI is say, when we commission pieces of work, a minimum of 50% of your references must be African. And that's, a way to uphold our own knowledge. And then also going to Sonia, the political need to slow down, to counter this very capitalist way of thinking of this, like, we have to get to a solution right now. And I think that's, like she said, it's also part of the problem, and we don't have the space to really stop and slow down and think about all the connections that can be made. As Pumi says, all oppression is linked, and making sure that that's underpinning our thoughts. And the act of slowing down in a world, in a time that doesn't allow us to do that, I think is an act of resistance itself. I think through COVID and the pandemic that made us all slow down, I really had hope that we would emerge from it thinking differently, moving at a different speed and rhythm. At least I tried to, I started NAWI, a lot of things were different for me. And when the world began to open up, and I was at the CSW this year, and going out into that space was a little bit dystopic. Like, we've had this time to think and reflect, and everything was turned upside down, but everything at the UN is exactly the same, and people are engaging in exactly the same way. And I just felt a little bit crazy and a bit gaslit. I don't know how to explain it. But I think if there's more and more of us building a movement of slowing it down, thinking more, going back to unpacking and unlearning so much of what we think and hold to be true about our movements and about the work and about the connection, I think that's political resistance. And knowing that it's no mean feat to do that. Funding is pushing you to work on advocacy, but advocacy for what if we don't even have our own narrative to which we're fighting for? We don't quite understand what liberation feels like, smells like, walks like in our current day context. And so really taking from this, it's the act of slowing down. It's the act of reclaiming the work that we know we've done before. Now we've done a piece that talks about in a time not so far away, that is future looking, but in one way, it's in a time not so far away in the past that we need to reclaim and use as we fight and struggle. And just the act of unlearning, but working, yes, in solidarity, but also making spaces for our own to do some deep thinking and unpacking of all these things outside of all the noise of everything that is coming down on us. And someone can tell the donors to fund this, because that's an act of reparations.
Wonderful, Crystal. And I hope you'll put the link to In a Time Not So Far Away. It's a brilliant document, that very inspiring. Tamara, I'm going to go to you and then to you, Patty, just to join in this conversation about what does it mean to take collective power seriously? Where are we going? How are we building alignment for that, toward that?
I wish I could make it complicated. We have to govern. I feel like the most complicated thing we could do is stop ceding all the grounds for everything we need to people who don't want us to live, much less win. So if we're not moving into a position to govern, we are leaving it to the people who aren't interested in that.
That's like a mic drop. Woo, thank you. Patty, over to you.
I think what was said in the previous segment, I feel physically relief when I hear that we don't have to have an answer to everything. perhaps we could think more specifically about what are the questions we should ask ourselves and work with the movements in that dialogue. I think that breaking with the isolation and helping others break with that isolation, that's both an individual and collective isolation, is a basic experience. And it's a starting point for building that collective power that Alexa was referring to. I also feel that we're putting a lot of weight on the importance of a debate or a discussion with the donors and with philanthropy. When we stay stuck in terms of projects, that takes you on a very different path, different than the one that you need to think on social processes, which, as colleagues were saying, take a lot of time. How can we think about those processes and encourage the donors and philanthropy to also think in terms of processes? It's very complex and complicated when they're asking us for very quick, immediate results. But also when it comes to those famous indicators, we need to include other indicators that have to do with our daily lives and the daily lives of people and of women in particular. And lastly, I think that a lot of the debates that are creating tension within the feminist movement, I think we can also contribute by decodifying the language. What are we talking about? What I perceive is that oftentimes these debates are occurring on different layers. Everything is being mixed together. And it's difficult. It's difficult because it has implications for our emotions, our lives, our bodies. So how can we help to build bridges, to decodify in a way, to translate, to go into more detail into those debates, those discussions that can make it difficult for us to understand each other? Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Thanks everyone. And I think it's, the core of this conversation is something people have spoken to in various ways about the need for multiple strategies, that we need that space, Crystal, that you're talking about, to slow down, to actually have the imaginative and reflective space to see where is it that we want to go. And yet we also have to take your challenge in tomorrow about governing. So it's we could see those as contradictory, but we can also see those as a complementarity of a spectrum of strategies of the deep work of movement building, as you said, Pumi, the incredible challenge. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about human beings under incredible strain, stress, and repression by design, and needing to forge connections, trust, alignment around a vision that we're still trying to give birth to. So I think I appreciate the complexity of these conversations, and and as you mentioned, Sonia, we need complex challenges demand complex solutions. So I think that's the engagement I'm hearing here, and that also we don't have to solve everything, and we can recuperate knowledge. We are not alone in history having thought these things through. And so what can we learn from existing and past movements and activists and communities that have always been in resistance? So there's a lot I think, to build on here. We want to do, I want to invite the rest of the speakers that have been with us today. So all of you who have been in one of these conversations, Zeph, Tarso, Sonia, turn on your cameras and join us. And I'm going to do something maybe a little bit unfair, but I think it's important because these conversations they surface a lot of questions that can make us feel despairful. And there's a lot of pain in these conversations. but there's also a lot of hope, right? There's a lot of hope that we need to feed and fuel that, because that's also by design. It would be so much easier for those who seek to consolidate power if we gave up. And we're not going to do that. So I wanted to just go around and ask a question. And I'm going to ask for a brief answer, because this question could invite a dissertation or a short answer, maybe both. What are we building power for? Big question, but I want to do a round and ask each of you. So I'm just going to go through and, Phumi, I seem to be starting with you each time. So I'm going to start with you and put you on the spot yet again. And then we'll go through everyone else here. So adelante.
We have to defeat the systems of oppression. We have to eliminate them, not just in the way in which it comes up, like in 10 years, we will achieve this. We need a concrete strategy, anti-capitalist, eliminating patriarchy, white supremacy. We need to make sure that these systems are out of our lives. And then at the same time, think about how will we do life and living in a world in which we have understood to be causing us so much divisions and violence.
Thank you, Phumi. Patty, what are we building power for?
Phumi just said it. She just said it all, I think. To eliminate all the oppressions, the historic oppressions that we have experienced, and also to live well, not only to eliminate what doesn't work for us, but to build harmonious relationships between human beings and nature on Earth. That's it.
Beautiful, Patty. Crystal?
How can I possibly say anything after Phumi and Patty? But maybe just a little bit to add is we're building, at least where I'm sitting, I'm building towards freedom, and freedom to, like I said last time, not just freedom from, because I think for so much of our lives we fight, we're responsive, freedom from violence, freedom from oppression. But I wonder what it would be like to rethink that and fight for freedoms to live in joy, to live in dignity, freedom to flourish, to thrive for both everybody, but also the planet as well. Can we also allow our planet to thrive and our rivers to flow and our plants to grow without being extracted and violated and oppressed and all of those things. So it's a freedom too for me, in addition to, as a footnote to everything that Patty and Phumi have said.
Thank you. Sonia, what are we building power for?
Yeah. To recapture a film Mbebe, I would say that our generation, the younger generation, as generations from the past, have been struggling for a more breathable world, mundo más respirable, ¿no? Creo que esa imagen, this image by Mbebe is a very inspiring image, but I cannot not say that I also think we are struggling to resist, and to resist effectively is one key challenge we have in front of us. We cannot lose sight of that, because otherwise that breathable world will not come. And I apologize for being so realistic, but I really, from where I look at, I do think we have to keep that realistic compass very sharp in our hands.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I don't apologize, because if we aren't realistic, we won't build effective strategies. So thank you for that. Over to you, Tarso.
Goodness. To follow on these, I would just say, I think power for many things, power for freedom, for flourishing, for lives full of awe rather than fear, power to share and to relinquish, not power for the sake of power.
Beautiful. Tamara?
I add 2 words, choice and chance.
I think you're a poet. I think you're a poet. Every time you say something, it's like this perfectly condensed pearl of wisdom. Seth.
Agreeing with everyone that's being put on the table. And I just want to quote one of revolutionaries from the Philippines that say, Leon Alejandro, the struggle for freedom is the next best thing to actually being free. So I think how we dream, how we envision the world is actually an act of feeling and tasting that bit of freedom that we aspire for.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Seth. I'm going to give the last word to you, Shireen. Take us to the close and add to that.
Thank you to everybody. Yeah, Salima, a world built of and through love. I had jotted down something that said we're building power to be human and to be human together. I feel like it's kind of a difficult task to bring this dialogue to a close, because I feel like we've begun a conversation and I just wanted to keep going on, because we've created community, we've created space, and we're engaging with very, very complex sets of ideas, possibilities for strategy and action. And this is a rare space. It's a community of thinkers and activists thinking and strategizing together. And that also, I think, replenishes and refuels us. Certainly me. It gives me energy, it gives me hope, it gives me pathways for the possibilities of, I think, what you, Sonia, are putting on the table. How do we continue to resist at the same time? How do we center what it means to be joyful and filled with awe? So I'm going to close us in this part of our dialogue by saying really thank you to all who've participated in this 2-part conversation. I think we've done an incredibly deep dive in a very, very short space of time. And my head and my heart are full. There is a lot to think about. There is a lot to process. And we invite all of you to continue this conversation in your different spaces and places, in relation to power, liberatory movement, strategy, and action, because it's going to take us all. It's going to take us all. It's going to be slow and hard work. It's going to need to center some of the things that we have raised in this conversation as we think and rethink, learn and unlearn what it means to be, right, in organizing spaces and how to do movement work together. I'd like to also just flag that we will be sharing a set of resources from this dialogue, including summary notes and a graphic record. So look out for that. It will be coming your way soon. And really, lastly, thanks to the graphic documenter, panelists, listeners, the back-end team, of whom there are many, and everyone who has contributed to really making this 2-part dialogue both engaging and thought-provoking, and certainly took us deeper than I think we initially imagined. Just to say, I think that this conversation is also going to be informing Jazz's strategy and strategy work as we move forward in the next number of months. So celebrating all of you, sending you lots of love, lots of joy, and space, right, and spaciousness as we begin, end our days, depending on where we are. And just a deep thank you for being part of and being in community in this way. So be well, take care, until soon. Thank you all.